I'm going to start at the beginning. My wife, Nita, passed away on May 1st, 2021. From early onset Alzheimer's. She was 67 years old. She was beautiful, smart, kind, generous. She was the most amazing partner I could ever have wished to have. And when we moved to Centerville in 2010, it was clear that something was going on. She started having spatial awareness issues. It wasn't as if she didn't know where Joann Fabrics was, but she was approaching it from a different direction. And she was often confused about how to get from our new home to places that she'd gone to frequently before. I remember thinking about it a little bit at the time, but not making too big a deal out of it. But looking back, I realized that that was an early sign of what was to come. She soon started having some difficulty with speech, and those speech issues were, the technical phrase is semantic aphasia. She would have difficulty finding the right word, or she would replace a wrong word, be in the wrong place in a sentence. And people started remarking on that. And I'd say, I don't know. I really don't know what's going on. And Nita was aware of it, but we didn't think or want to talk too much about it. I know it troubled her. And not long after that, she started having some issues with people. She started suffering from some kind of paranoia or distrust. She had some trouble in some stores with some people. She got us fired from our primary care physician. And it had affected her ability to keep a job. Nita has always had a history of depression and anxiety, and she'd been treated for it effectively with pharmaceuticals and with counseling. But things really started going off the rails in mid-2015. She started getting very paranoid and aggressive with me about what was going on between me and one of my assistants, which there was nothing going on, but she was convinced that it was. It was frightening, and I really became concerned and not sure that there was really a future for us together, because it was just, I didn't know what to do. I really didn't know what to do. It got so bad at one point where I had to leave the house. I had to go away for a day or two. And I had the good fortune to share a meal with a friend of mine who has a lot of experience in the mental health field. And as I described what was going on with Nita and what was happening, he commented, and I don't remember anything else that he said, but the words that he used that really struck me was, oh my God, how much she is suffering. And it was at that point where those words really saved me. I think they saved our marriage. Because up to that point, like I said, I was concerned about what was happening to me and the fear that I had about the future. But that flipped the script for me, and it made me able to believe that there was something that maybe I could do to help her. And so I went back with a different attitude, and things did get better. We did pursue mental health as the problem, but that quickly became obvious that that wasn't really what was going on. And so when she started having some trouble managing the household finances, bills were going missed and things of that nature, we finally decided to seek out a medical diagnosis, and the diagnosis came back with advanced Alzheimer's dementia, which was a gut punch because she was still doing a lot of stuff on her own. And she was well enough that we were able to go out and do some traveling. We went off to see friends that she hadn't seen in a long time, that she wanted to see before, the ultimate sentence, which Alzheimer's is, would, impose itself on her. We managed to do that for about a year and a half, and then it got to the point where traveling was just very scary for her. Being anywhere that she wasn't comfortable, where she didn't know, it wasn't a familiar place, became almost impossible for her to be. Nita had a master's degree in theater arts with a concentration in costume design. She was a master seamstress. She sewed many beautiful things, one of which was her wedding dress. It was a hobby and a skill that she had used to quiet her mind and to give her great pleasure throughout her entire lifetime. But there came a point where she could no longer manage her sophisticated Husqvarna sewing machine. And I found her staring at a very simple Singer sewing machine in Walmart one evening when we were there. And she looked at me and asked if we could get it. And I said, of course. I went and took a hour-long class over at Joann Fabrics to learn how to use the machine so that I could help her if she got into trouble with it. And it wasn't really a month or two later that I walked into the sewing room and I found her packing up all of her sewing material, all of her thread, all of her needles, all of her scissors, boxes and boxes of fabric, a lifetime of time spent in pleasure. And I walked over to her and I put my hand on her shoulder and she turned to me and I said, Nita, we'll find a way to make this work. And she turned back to the sewing table and took both her arms and swept everything off the table onto the floor and collapsed on the floor sobbing. And in that moment, I collapsed on the floor sobbing with her as well. It was probably the saddest moment of my life. What I realized in that moment was that I could not save her. There was nothing that was in my power that I was going to be able to make it better, make it okay. That we were going to travel this road together and it was just going to get worse. And it did. It got a lot worse as time went by. Over the course of the next year and a half, Nita declined to the point where she could not care for herself at all. She had to be dressed. She had to be fed sometimes. She lost the ability to make the connection between putting a pill in her mouth and swallowing with water. She became completely nonverbal. And I was able to care for her in home with the help of a good friend who came in a couple days a week. But for the most part, it was 24/7 care, and I was glad to be able to do it. But it got really, really awful at the end. She became very agitated. She would lash out. And there wasn't really anything I could do to make her feel okay or comfort her. Hospice had been after me for quite some time to take a respite, 5 days, where Nita could go inpatient, they'd take care of her, and I'd have a little break. I'd resisted that because, it's my job to take care of her. She's my wife, she's the woman I love, and that's who should be taking care of her. But it got so bad one morning that I just had to pick up the phone and call them. And they came and they found a place for her at the Drake Center in Cincinnati. And she went there on a Monday. And they told me not to come down on Tuesday, to take a full day off, which I did, and I decompressed, and I thought, this is okay. And so I went down there on Wednesday morning. By that time, she was unable to walk across the room to the bathroom on her own. And she'd been fully ambulatory 2 days before that. By the following day, they told me that she'd never be suitable to come home. And they told me that in the morning, and by the afternoon, they told me that she'd never leave hospice. On Friday, they called me and said that she had begun Cheyne-Stokes breathing, which is a sign of imminent death. I packed a bag and I went down there and I sat next to her all day Friday and through the night into Saturday morning. And at 7:15 in the morning, she passed. And I wailed, "Thank God her suffering is over." And in that moment, I realized that I was saying the same thing. It was for me too. That this long, dark period had come to an end. And almost immediately, the thought entered my mind that I had broken her heart when I'd made the decision to move her from home to hospice, to take her out of the environment where she felt mostly safe, with the dogs that she still loved and engaged with. And I allowed her to go to a place where strangers took care of her, and that I left her alone without seeing her for a day. And I carried that thought and 100 other thoughts of all the things that I wished I'd done, that I wished I hadn't done, that I know now, and I kind of knew then, were the thoughts that every person who's cared for a person with that kind of disease for a long time will have. But I was in this very dark and desolate land that I couldn't really escape from, and I was full of emptiness. That doesn't make any sense, but that's kind of the way I felt. I couldn't make any sense of what was going on. In my lifetime, in my experience in recovery, books have been really essential in helping me understand things when I'm lost. And so off I went to the bookstore, and I found a book called A Search for the Soul. It's a fascinating book. It explores the idea of what is a human soul, and one of the ways that the author used to demonstrate how a soul manifests itself was through the poetry of William Wordsworth. I liked the book, I read it, I put it aside, and a month or two later, I'm back at the bookstore, and I'm looking for a book of poems by William Wordsworth. And of course, in a modern day bookstore, the poetry section is about this wide, and it's about 3 or 4 shelves and maybe 100, 150 books. And so I walk over there, and there's a bright colored dust jacket on the top shelf that says 100 poems that will break your heart. And I say, no, not now. My heart's already broken. And I look down through all the books for something by William Wordsworth, and there's nothing there. I can't find anything. So I stand back up, and I'm face to face with 100 poems again, and I say no again. I look for an anthology of poems by William Wordsworth. Nothing. So I stand back up, I pull that book off the shelf, 100 poems that are going to break my heart, and I open it up, and the first poem is by William Wordsworth. And it's a poem called Surprised by Joy. I encourage you to look it up. It'll break your heart, as will many of the other poems in that book. I took it home and I read it. I'd read 2 or 3 chapters about a poem each night. And it really helped me start to understand the human process of grieving, because these poets were expressing it in their words. About halfway through the book, I came upon a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And the author indicated that there were 2 lines in that poem that the author had lifted directly from Shakespeare's Sonnet 72. So I'm laying in bed, I reach over, grab my notepad by the bed, and I write down Sonnet 72. I turn out the light, I go to bed. The next evening, it's a beautiful summer evening, I come home, I'm going back to grab my book, and I see my note, Sonnet 72, and I say, I gotta go look that up. So I walk out to the living room, I know I have the sonnets. I walk straight to the bookshelf, pull it right off the bookshelf, and I open it up, and there's a note. There's a folded piece of note paper with one corner dog-eared down, and on that corner is written, happy, 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 in my darling Nita's hand. And I open it up, and on the left-hand side are 2 impressions of her lips. And on the right-hand side is a love letter. It's the letter she wrote me on the occasion of giving me that book on our 4th wedding anniversary. And in that letter, she expresses her unreserved love for me, her happiness that we were together, and how much she looked forward to living our lives together. And I was released from that dark place. that I had been living in for months. I couldn't save her, but she saved me.